ask you to get your Bibles. Take one out of the pew rack there or open your own. I've got my Bible open to Matthew chapter 13. We're going to spend some time in Matthew 13, and then we're going to be in Matthew chapter 18. And so you may want to mark both of those places. Matthew 13 and Matthew 18. Matthew is that first book of the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John are those four Gospels, and Matthew is that first one. And so if you'll open your Bibles there to that 13th chapter. We've got a great knock-knock joke. Okay? You ready to hear it? Brother Scott, you start it. Who's there? That's great, isn't it? Doesn't work that way around, does it? Yeah. That's it. I'm sorry if that's as funny as it's going to get this morning. So, I think there are times that we look at the kingdom in much the same way. There are times that we think about what God is doing, and we want to be involved, and we're excited about the fact that Jesus Christ is real and He wants to change our lives. But I think there are times that we approach it just as we did this joke, that we say that we see God at work, but it's almost like He then gives us the lead. Just as I told Scott, you start. You know, every knock-knock joke starts with, knock, knock, who's there? But you got to have something else to bring the punch. Well, that's where we're going to get to today. And I've entitled today's message, Growing Pains. We've looked at the last several weeks at the idea of God and His kingdom. And I'm so thankful for Lanny Bridges being here last week and the way God was at work in that process, and Lanny looking at the King Himself with you last week. And we've looked at how the kingdom is here. The kingdom is real. But I want you to see what it's about. First part of your outline says, okay, we're here. Now what do we do? Have you ever been to one of those meetings or one of those parties or maybe even a family reunion where everyone gathers together and you get in the circle or you gather in the living room and you just sort of sit there because nobody's sure what's supposed to happen next? There's a tension in the room. Nobody's sure who's in control, or the people who are in the room don't really like one another very much. And you wonder who's going to crack first. And I think there are times where as we approach God and as we wonder what is it He wants us to do with our lives, that we say, God, I'm here. What do you want me to do? Well, Jesus tells us. It's not just that He has described the kingdom in several ways, and we're going to look at those as we look at His explanation today too. He says the kingdom is here, but now He tells us what is it that we're supposed to do. And so I want you to look first with me in Matthew chapter 13. I'm going to read several verses, the first 23 verses there. And I'll show you a couple of points, and then we're going to move over into chapter 18. Matthew chapter 13, starting in verse 1. That day Jesus went out of the house and was sitting by the sea. And large crowds gathered to Him. So He got into a boat and He sat down, and the whole crowd was standing on the beach. He spoke many things to them in parables, saying, Behold, the sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell beside the road, and the birds came up and ate them. Others fell on the rocky places where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up because they had no depth of soil. But when the sun had risen, they were scorched. And because they had no root, they withered away. Others fell among the thorns, and the thorns came up and choked them out. And others fell on the good soil and yielded a crop, some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. He who has ears, let him hear. Verse 10. And the disciples came and said to Him, Why do you speak to them in parables? And Jesus answered them, To you it has been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been granted. For whoever has, to him more shall be given, and he shall have an abundance. But whoever does not have, even what he has shall be taken away from him. Therefore I speak to them in parables, because while seeing they do not see, and while hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. In their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled, which says, You'll keep on hearing, but you'll not understand. You'll keep on seeing, but will not perceive. For the heart of the people has become dull. With their ears they scarcely hear, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they would see with their eyes, hear with their ears and understand with their heart and return, and I would heal them. But blessed are you. Blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. For truly I say to you that many prophets and righteous men desired to see what you see and did not see it, and to hear what you hear and did not hear it. Verse 18. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown on his heart. This is the one on whom seed was sown beside the road. Verse 20. The one on whom seed was sown on the rocky places, this is the man who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no firm root in himself. He is only temporary. And when affliction or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he falls away. Verse 22. And on the one on whom seed was sown among the thorns, this is the man who hears the word, and the worry of the world and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. And the one on whom seed was sown on the good soil, this is the man who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and brings forth some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. Two things I want you to see from this passage. Lots to look at, but two main things about the king and his people. We know the kingdom is here. Jesus has told us that, and he's described it in several ways. But what is it that we're supposed to do? If we're in the kingdom, what are we to be like? First thing I want you to see is this. The presence of the kingdom produces fruit. That when God begins to work in your life, you will produce fruit. You'll be different. Look how Jesus describes it in the first part of chapter 13. He uses the parable, and he talks about a sower, a man, a farmer who was going to plant. And in that day, the sower would have had some type of a holder, a basket, or maybe a sling, and he would grab a handful of seed and just broadcast it. He would toss it out. Their agricultural ways were not as refined as ours. They would have a plot, but they may not have had rows, and they definitely didn't have the electronics and the technology and the horsepower that we have today. And so they would toss it out, and where it would land, there it might or might not grow. And he says there's four basic ideas. He said some fell beside the road, and the birds simply ate it up. It didn't plant. Others, verse 5, fell on rocky places where there wasn't much soil, but enough that it immediately sprang up. But when the sun came, it scorched it, and it wilted and died. But then there's a third group where it grows, but the thorns grew with it and choked it out. Then there's that fourth type of soil where it grows. It's good soil and it yields a crop, but it's different. Each part of the soil may produce a slightly different amount. Some will be 100 times, some 60 and some 30. And so I want you to see this, that when God begins to work in your life, when you acknowledge the fact that Jesus is who he said he is and will be and was, that you need him in your life because you are unrighteous without him, that when he comes into your life, he begins to work. But Jesus says you have to be careful because you want to be like this fourth soil. So look how he explains it further in verses 18 through 23. He says, here then is the parable. He explains it. It's one of the few times that he explains it. Here in chapter 13, he begins this series of parables about the kingdom. We didn't start here because I wanted you to see how he described it first. We spent several weeks looking at the kingdom itself, but now he's telling us this is what people in my kingdom look like. And he gives the explanation here. He says that when anyone hears the word of the kingdom and doesn't understand it, he says, then there's a problem. The evil one comes and snatches it away.